The thing about silence. There are things you carry for years without realizing how heavy they are. Not because you forget them, because you made a decision early on to keep them down, to not let them surface. And for a long time, that works. You go about your life. You sleep. Mostly. You don't think about the desert unless something forces you to. 11 years. That's how long I kept this. I want to be clear about something before I say anything else. I was asked not to talk about this. Not warned, not threatened, asked. Quietly. By a man who had no reason to lie to me and every reason to protect what he knew. I respected that ask. I still respect him. But something happened recently that made me feel like staying quiet was no longer the right choice. I'll get to that. I'm not doing this for any other reason than I think someone needs to hear it before they make the same mistake I almost made. Before they go somewhere they shouldn't. Before they treat a boundary like a suggestion. Some places have rules. Not posted rules. Not laws. Older than that. The kind of rules that exist because something happened long before anyone alive today was born, and the people who survived it made sure the lesson didn't die with them. You can respect that without fully understanding it. I didn't. Not at first. I thought I did, but I didn't. That distinction matters. Thinking you respect something and actually respecting it are not the same thing. I learned that out there. I'm going to tell you what happened over those 4 days in the high desert. I'm going to tell you what we found, what we heard, and what one man said to me on a long drive back down a dirt road with the windows up, even though it was 90 degrees outside. I'm going to tell you as accurately as I can, which means some of it will be incomplete. Not because I'm protecting anything anymore. Because some of what happened, I still don't have words for. That's not a figure of speech.
I genuinely do not have the language for certain parts of this, and I've thought about it for 11 years. Why I'm saying this now? I wouldn't be talking if it had stayed in the past. That's the honest answer. If it had stayed something that happened once, to a small group of people, in a place most people will never go, I could have kept carrying it. I was doing fine. Not perfect, but fine. About 6 weeks ago, a man named Daniel Ferris went into the same corridor. I don't know Daniel personally. I know someone who does. That's how I found out. He went in with 2 others, a woman he worked with and her younger brother, and they were doing what people do out there. Photography, landscape work, that kind of thing. Nothing unusual about the trip on paper. They had permits, they had gear. They knew the terrain in the way that people know terrain from maps and prior trips to nearby areas. They didn't know what the terrain knows about itself. 2 of them came back after 3 days. The third, Daniel, came back 4 days after that, alone, having covered on foot a distance that shouldn't have been possible in that time without water resupply. When they found him, he was sitting on the side of a road, 11 miles from where he'd last been seen. Sitting, not collapsed, sitting upright, very still, facing the desert. He wasn't injured. That was the first thing everyone said. No injuries. Like, that was the reassuring part. I heard that and felt something drop in my chest. Because I know what it looks like when someone has been close to it. Not harmed by it. Not taken by it. Just close enough. There's a stillness that comes into a person. A reorientation. Like something inside them has been moved slightly to the left and hasn't moved back. You can see it in how they hold their eyes. How long it takes them to respond when someone speaks to them. Daniel apparently sat in that hospital room for the better part of a day without initiating a single conversation.
That's not trauma in the way people usually mean it. That's something else. I don't know what Daniel saw. I haven't spoken to him. I'm not sure speaking to him would clarify anything, even if I did. Because the thing about getting close to what's out there is that it doesn't leave you with a clean story. It leaves you with pieces, sensations, a knowledge that lives in the body before it reaches the mind, if it reaches the mind at all. He went into the same corridor. He came back changed. That was enough for me. How I got there. I should explain who I was before this, because it matters for understanding why I was there at all. I spent several years doing field work in the Southwest. Not research, not tourism, practical work. Land surveys, boundary assessments, some contract work for conservation groups that needed people who could move through difficult terrain without needing to be managed. I was good at it. I was comfortable in desert environments in a way that took years to build, and that I was, honestly, probably too proud of. That pride is relevant. I want to name it now because it shaped decisions I made later. Through that work, I came into contact with a man named Raymond Runningwater. That's not a name I use lightly or without his implicit permission, though permission is complicated now, given everything. Raymond was, at the time, in his late 50s. He had spent decades working as a tracker, first for search and rescue operations across 3 states, leader in a more traditional capacity that he didn't describe in detail and that I didn't press him on. He was Navajo. He was from the Eastern Reservation area. And he was, without question, the most capable person in any landscape I have ever worked alongside. We met on a boundary survey job. We worked together for about 9 days. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was worth listening to. By the end of that job, I had enough respect for him that when he contacted me the following spring and asked if I wanted to join a small tracking expedition into a high desert corridor about 60 miles northeast of where we'd worked before, I said yes, without asking many questions. I should have asked more questions. He told me it was a training exercise of sorts, that he and 2 other trackers, men he'd worked with for years, wanted to document certain features of the terrain. Animal movement patterns, geological markers. He said it would be 4 days. He said I should bring enough water for 6. I remember thinking that was overcautious. I remember almost saying so. The corridor he was referring to sits inside what is technically public land, but in the way that certain public land exists on paper while belonging, in every meaningful sense, to something else. The Navajo Nation's formal boundary doesn't include it, but that doesn't mean it's unclaimed. There are places the nation doesn't formally claim because claiming them would require acknowledging them. That's something I only understood later. I drove out on a Thursday morning in early October. The light in that part of the desert in October is specific. It's low and lateral, and it makes everything look like it's being examined. I remember thinking that on the drive-in, that the light felt like attention. Raymond was already at the staging area when I arrived. So were the other 2 men, both of whom were introduced to me by first name only, Thomas and Calvin. Both younger than Raymond, though not young. Both quiet in the particular way that people are quiet when they are already in a professional mode, already reading the environment, already working. We shook hands. We checked gear. Raymond looked at my pack and added 2 items to it without explaining why. A piece of cord tied in a specific pattern, and a small bundle of something dry and tied with red thread that I didn't ask about, and he didn't offer to explain. We started walking just before 8 in the morning. For the first several hours, it felt exactly like what it was supposed to be. 4 people moving through difficult terrain with a clear purpose. Tracking is methodical work. It asks you to slow down in a way that modern movement doesn't. You look at the ground. You look at what the ground is doing, what it remembers, what it's been asked to hold. I was learning from watching Raymond and the others, the way they communicated without speaking, the vocabulary of small gestures, the way a hand held flat meant stop, and a hand turned slightly palm up meant look here and look carefully. I was focused. I was engaged. I felt useful. That feeling lasted until early afternoon on the first day, when we reached the dry wash. The first thing that was off. The dry wash wasn't remarkable to look at. That's the thing I keep coming back to. If you had shown me a photograph of it,
I would have said it looked like every other dry wash in that part of the desert. A shallow cut in the earth, maybe 4 feet deep at its lowest point, edges worn smooth by water that hadn't moved through there in a long time. Sandy floor, some scrub on the upper banks, rocks that had been pushed into rough arrangement by old flooding and hadn't moved since. Nothing about it looked wrong. Raymond stopped about 15 feet from the edge. He didn't hold up his hand. He didn't make any gesture at all. He just stopped walking. And because the other two were reading him the way they always were, they stopped too. I stopped because they stopped. That's the honest version. The 4 of us stood there. I counted later because it stuck with me. 4 minutes and some seconds of complete stillness. No one spoke. No one gestured.
Raymond stood with his weight slightly back, which I'd learned by then was his posture for reading a space rather than moving through it. Thomas was looking at the far bank of the wash. Calvin was looking at the ground between us and the edge. I looked at what Calvin was looking at. I didn't see anything. That bothered me more than if I had. After those 4 minutes, Raymond made the hand signal that meant move, and we crossed the wash, and nobody said anything about what had just happened. I let it go. I told myself it was technique, that they had seen or sensed something about the terrain that my less experienced eye had missed. An unstable bank, maybe, or animal sign I hadn't been trained to read yet. I almost convinced myself. It was Thomas who made it impossible to fully let go. About 20 minutes after we crossed, when we had put enough distance behind us that the wash was no longer visible, he came up beside me while we walked and said, without looking at me, "Keep your eyes moving. Don't let them rest on anything too long in there." I asked him what he meant by "in there." He nodded forward, ahead of us. I said, "What are we looking for?" He said, "We're looking so that it knows we're looking. That's different." Then he moved back to his position in the group and didn't say anything else for the rest of the afternoon. I turned that over in my head for hours. The phrasing of it. Not looking for something. Looking so that something knew you were looking. That's an entirely different relationship with observation. It implies the thing being watched is aware of being watched. It implies that your attention is not just a tool you're using, but a signal you're sending. And whatever was out there in that corridor, whatever existed past that dry wash, it was something that received signals. I didn't sleep well that first night. Not because anything happened. Because nothing did. Because the desert was too quiet, in a way I couldn't immediately locate. I have spent a lot of nights in open desert, and there is always some sound. Insects, wind movement, the settling of cooling rock. Small animals that you never see but always hear at the edges. That night, there was nothing. And the nothing had a quality to it, a texture. Like the silence wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had displaced it. I lay in my sleeping bag and looked at the sky and kept my eyes moving, the way Thomas had said. Not because I thought it would help, because I didn't know what else to do with the instruction. What the land was doing. The second day was when I stopped explaining things away. There's a process the mind goes through when it encounters something it doesn't have a category for. It reaches first for the nearest available explanation. Then it reaches for a less comfortable one. Then, if the thing persists, it stops reaching and just looks. That's where I got to on the second day. I stopped reaching. We moved deeper into the corridor after sunrise. The terrain shifted in the way desert terrain does. Not dramatically, but with intention. That's the only word I have for it. The landscape wasn't changing randomly the way geography changes. It felt considered. Like whatever shaped this particular stretch of ground had a reason for each decision. The first thing I noted was the line. It wasn't visible exactly. More like a threshold you felt in your body before your eyes confirmed it. We crossed it maybe 2 hours into the morning walk, and I know we crossed it because all 3 trackers adjusted simultaneously. Subtle,
a slight change in how they carried their weight, how often they checked behind them. Raymond began moving with his head slightly lowered, which I hadn't seen him do before. I looked at the ground past the threshold. No tracks. Not reduced tracks. Not sparse tracks. No tracks.
In desert terrain that had clearly seen wind and light rain recently, terrain that should have been holding the passage of every lizard and rodent and bird that moved through it, there was nothing. The sand was smooth in a way that felt maintained rather than natural, like something had an interest in keeping it clear. I crouched down and looked at it more carefully. The smoothness wasn't uniform. There were patterns in it. Not prints, not gouges. Patterns. Shallow, regular. The way you might see if something had moved over the surface repeatedly in the same path. But the paths didn't have a consistent direction. They intersected. They curved back on themselves. Whatever made them wasn't moving through the area. It was moving around something in the area. Orbiting something. Again and again and again. I didn't point this out. I got the distinct feeling that pointing it out would be the wrong thing to do. That acknowledgement had a cost out there. The birds were gone by mid-morning. This sounds like a small thing, until you understand what birds mean in desert navigation. They are the constant. Even in the most inhospitable terrain, you have ravens. You have the occasional hawk riding thermals. You have small, fast desert birds in the scrub that you hear before you see. They are how you know the air is normal. When they stop, something in the system has changed. I heard the last one maybe 90 minutes past the threshold. A single call from somewhere above and to my left. One note. And then nothing. I looked up instinctively. Saw nothing. Looked at Raymond. He was already looking at where the sound had come from. His expression didn't change. He looked back at the ground ahead and kept walking. By early afternoon, the scrub had thinned to almost nothing. The rocks were larger here, scattered in arrangements that my eye kept trying to read as intentional, and my brain kept refusing to confirm. I would look at a grouping and think, that's a marker, and then move closer and find nothing that proved it, and move away and look back and think it again. The landscape was doing something to my pattern recognition, activating it constantly without ever satisfying it. Calvin stopped once for about 30 seconds and pressed his palm flat against a large rock face. Not dramatically, the way you'd check a surface temperature. He pulled his hand back and looked at his palm. Then he looked at Raymond. Raymond gave one slow nod, and they kept moving. I didn't ask. The quality of the light changed in the late afternoon, in a way I don't fully know how to describe. The angle was consistent with the time of day. The color was not. There was something yellowish in it. Not sunset. Something different. Like the light was being filtered through something between us and the sky that wasn't cloud cover. I looked up several times. The sky was clear. We made camp earlier than the previous night. Raymond chose the site. He walked the perimeter of it twice before he allowed packs to come off. Then he and Thomas did something at the 4 compass points of the camp. Something low and quiet that I kept enough distance from to not hear clearly. And I kept that distance because it felt correct to do so. That night, before it got full dark, I finally said something. I asked Raymond about the tracks, the absence of them. I asked what made those patterns in the sand. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "It maps what it owns." I asked what that meant. He looked at the fire rather than at me. He said, "Some things don't move through a place. They maintain it. There's a difference." I sat with that. The desert around us was completely silent again. The same displaced silence as the night before.
but heavier now, more present.
We were deeper in than we'd been, and whatever produced that silence was closer, and I think all four of us knew it, and none of us said so, because out there, saying a thing and thinking a thing were not the same weight. What Raymond did. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, not because I'm protecting anyone, because I think the order in which information arrives matters, and if I give you the conclusion before I give you the sequence, you'll process it as a story. It wasn't a story. It was a thing that happened in real time to real people, and the realest part of it was that none of us understood it while it was happening. So I'll tell it in order. The third morning started normally, which I now understand was itself a kind of information. The desert had been so consistently abnormal by that point that normal should have registered as a warning. It didn't. We ate, we packed, we checked the perimeter. Raymond did his quiet work at the compass points again. We started walking. For the first hour, nothing. I had almost recalibrated to a kind of functional unease, the state where you're alert but not panicked, where the wrongness of a place has become the new baseline, and your body has stopped spending energy on alarm it can't sustain. I was observing, taking mental notes, watching the other three for the subtle signals I'd been learning to read. Then Raymond stopped. This stop was different from the one at the dry wash. That stop had been considered, professional, the stop of a man reading a space. This stop had a different quality. It was the stop of a man who had just received information that changed his calculations entirely. His whole body changed. Something went out of his posture. Not fear exactly. Something more specific than fear. Recognition. He stood very still for about 10 seconds. Then he turned around. Not to us. He didn't look at us, didn't signal us, didn't speak. He turned his body 180 degrees and began walking back the way we had come. His pace was measured, not running, but there was a quality to it, a directness, a lack of hesitation that communicated something I felt before I understood. He wasn't retreating. He was removing himself from a situation with a speed that his experience told him was necessary. Thomas and Calvin watched him go. I looked at them, waiting for an explanation, a gesture, something. Thomas was watching Raymond's back as he walked away. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was set in a way that told me he was working something out internally. Calvin had turned slightly and was looking out to our left into the open desert in the direction we had been heading. His posture was the stillest I had seen from him, and he was a naturally still person. About 30 seconds passed. Then Thomas looked at me and said, quietly, "Stay here. Don't move from this exact spot." He walked after Raymond. I stood there, alone, in the middle of a desert corridor that had spent 2 days demonstrating that something was wrong with it, watching 2 of the 3 people I trusted in this environment walk away from me without explanation. Calvin didn't move toward the others. He stayed where he was, still looking left. His right hand had moved to something on his belt. Not a weapon. A small leather case I hadn't paid attention to before. I said his name, quietly. He didn't look at me. He said, in a voice that was almost conversational, "Don't look in the direction I'm looking." I said, "Why?" He said, "'Cause I'm looking so it knows someone is. You look somewhere else so it knows we're in more than one place." I turned and looked back the way we had come. My heart was doing something specific that I don't have a clean word for. Not racing. Thudding. Slow and hard. Like my body had downshifted into a register it reserved for situations where speed was less important than endurance. Raymond was about 200 meters back by then. Still walking. Still that same measured, deliberate pace. I understood, standing there, that I was watching a man who knew exactly what he was doing, execute a decision he had made with complete clarity. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't confused. He had recognized something, and he had acted on that recognition without hesitation, without needing to explain it to anyone, because explanation was not the priority. That was the most frightening thing I had seen yet.
not what was out there to the left, whatever Calvin was holding his attention on. The fact that the most experienced man among us had looked at something I couldn't see in a landscape I barely understood and made an immediate, wordless decision to leave. Whatever Raymond recognized, he recognized it as beyond the threshold of what he was willing to engage with. And Raymond was not a man who had low thresholds. Calvin and I stood there for 11 minutes. I counted. Then he exhaled slowly, just once, and his hand came away from the leather case on his belt, and he turned to me and said, "We should go." I said, "What was it?" He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, the way someone looks at you when they're deciding how much of a true answer serves you. He said, "It was letting us know it had been aware of us since the wash." Then he started walking, and I followed him, and neither of us spoke until we reached the truck, where Raymond and Thomas were already waiting, and the engine was already running. What we heard that night. Raymond didn't drive out that evening. I expected him to. After what had happened that morning, after the walk back to the truck in silence, after the four of us sitting in and around that vehicle for the better part of an hour without anyone initiating a conversation, I assumed we were leaving. I wanted us to leave.
I didn't say that because the other three didn't seem to be operating from want in the way I was, and saying "I want to leave" felt like the wrong language for what was happening. Raymond made the decision to camp where we were. He didn't explain it. He got out of the truck, looked at the sky for a moment, looked at the terrain around the staging area, and started setting up. Thomas and Calvin followed. I followed them. The staging area was behind the dry wash, behind the threshold. Technically outside the corridor in the way that mattered, I told myself. I needed that to be true, so I let myself believe it. We ate without a fire that night. Raymond's decision. Cold food, minimal movement. Conversation that existed only when necessary, and in low voices even then. The kind of discipline that comes from deep practice, from having spent enough time in enough serious situations that the body just shifts into the correct register without being told. I did my best to match it. Full dark came fast, the way it does in open desert. No moon that night. The stars were present, but they weren't enough. The darkness had weight and direction, and it pressed in from the edges of the staging area in a way that I kept trying to reframe as normal and kept failing. I think it started around 11. I'm not certain of the time because I wasn't looking at anything that could tell me the time. I was lying on my back, looking at the stars, and I was doing the thing Thomas had taught me, keeping my eyes moving, not letting them rest. And I was doing it because it had become a habit by then, and habits persist even when the mind is barely functioning. The sound came from the north. Not a loud sound. That's important. Horror logic tells you that the frightening thing announces itself. This didn't. It was quiet enough that my first response was to question whether I'd heard it at all. A displacement of air almost. A movement that had a sound attached to it. The way large things moving through space have a sound. Not the sound of footsteps or breathing, but the sound of mass relocating. Of something that had been in one position, deciding to occupy another. Then, it was to the east. That's the part I've never been able to fully rationalize. Not the sound itself, but the repositioning. Because the repositioning happened without any of the transitional sound you would expect. No movement between the 2 points. Just presence in the north. And then, with no audible interval, presence in the east. Like the concept of traveling between locations didn't apply. I sat up slowly. Raymond was already sitting. He had been sitting, I realized, which meant he had not slept, which meant he had known to expect something. He was cross-legged, facing outward from the camp, and his eyes were closed. I want to be specific about that, because it seemed wrong, and then became the most correct thing I'd ever seen. He wasn't sleeping. He was listening with his entire body in a way that vision would have interrupted. I looked for Thomas and Calvin, both awake, both still. Calvin had his back against the truck tire and was looking at the ground in front of him. Thomas was on his side, apparently not moving, but his breathing was the breathing of someone who was very alert. The sound came from the west. Still no transition.
North, east, west. And then a pause. A long pause. Long enough that I began to wonder if it had stopped, if whatever was out there had lost interest or moved off. And that wondering was almost worse than the sound, because at least the sound told me where it was. It was in the south for a long time. South was behind me. I did not turn around. I made that decision, and I held it. And it was one of the harder things I've done, because every instinct I have said, turn around, look at it, know where it is.
But I remembered what Calvin had said about looking so that something knew you were looking, about the act of attention being a signal. And I thought about what it might mean to give that signal when something was that close. I didn't turn around. It stayed in the south for what I estimate was 40 minutes, moving but not departing, circling maybe, or maintaining. The sound had a rhythm to it that wasn't quite regular, like breathing that was almost patterned, but kept introducing a variation, kept refusing to become predictable. Raymond never opened his eyes the entire time. At some point, and I cannot tell you exactly when, the sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The silence that followed was the same displaced silence as the previous nights, but denser, more final. Like something had been confirmed rather than concluded. I didn't sleep. At first light, I looked at Raymond. He was in the same position, eyes still closed. And then, slowly, he opened them. He looked at the horizon for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "It was deciding." I asked, "Deciding what?" He said, "Whether we were worth the attention." He stood up and began making preparations for what came next. And I sat there in the early desert light trying to understand what it meant to have been evaluated by something I never saw, and what it meant that we were still there, and whether still being there was the good outcome, or simply a postponement of something I didn't yet have the capacity to understand. Morning. The thing in the sand. I don't know what I expected to see when the light came up fully. That's not quite true. I know exactly what I expected. I expected nothing. I expected the desert to look the way desert looks in morning light, flat and bleached and indifferent. And I expected that indifference to function as a kind of reset, the way daylight usually does after a bad night. Daylight has always felt like evidence to me. Proof that the world is still operating by the rules you understand. It didn't work that way. Raymond stood first, the way he always did, and he walked the perimeter of the camp, the way he always did, and I watched him complete about 2/3 of that circuit before he stopped. He stood very still. Then he crouched down. He didn't call us over. He just crouched there and looked. And because I was watching him, I stood and walked toward him. And when I got close enough to see what he was looking at, I stopped walking. Around the camp, in the sand, there were impressions. I want to be careful with this word because impression is doing a lot of work, and I don't want it to mislead you. These were not footprints. I need to say that clearly because footprint is the word the mind reaches for, and it is the wrong word. Footprints imply a shape you can reference, a biological logic, a thing that has feet and therefore moves in the way that footed things move. These did not have that logic. They were depressions in the sand. Irregular in shape, but not random. There was a consistency to them that suggested they came from the same source, the same whatever. But the shapes didn't repeat exactly the way footprints repeat. They varied. Like whatever made them was not making consistent contact with the ground. Like the relationship between the thing and the surface beneath it was not fixed. They formed a circuit. A complete circuit around the entire perimeter of our camp. Not approximate. Not almost. Complete. Whatever made these had gone
all the way around, without gap, without break, and the circuit was close. 12 feet from where I had been lying. 11 from where Raymond had been sitting with his eyes closed. Thomas walked the circuit slowly, not stepping inside it, staying on the outside. He was looking at the impressions the way a person looks at text in a language they almost speak. Like comprehension was close, but kept refusing to arrive.
Calvin stood at the edge and did not walk the circuit. He looked at a single section of it for a long time. Then he took out the small leather case from his belt, the one he had reached for the day before, and he opened it and took something small from it and placed it carefully on the ground at the edge of the impression, nearest to where he had slept. I looked at what he placed there. I still don't know what it was. Something small and pale and tied, the way the bundle in my pack was tied, with thread. He covered it partially with sand. Then he stepped back. I looked at the full circuit again, tried to count the individual impressions, lost count somewhere above 40, and started again, and lost count again. There was something about looking at them directly that made the count resist me. My eyes would move across them and then skip, like a scratch on a record, like something in my visual processing was refusing to total them up. Raymond was still crouched at the point where he had first stopped. He had not moved from that spot. He was looking at one specific impression that was slightly different from the others. Deeper, maybe. Or not deeper exactly. More present. The way a word in a sentence carries more weight than the words around it without being longer. I crouched next to him and looked at it. I don't have a shape to give you. I've tried, over the years, to reconstruct it in terms of geometry, and I can't. It wasn't a shape that geometry handles. It was more like the absence of a shape, a place where the sand had been displaced in a way that implied a form without recording one. Like whatever made it didn't have edges in the way that physical things have edges. Raymond looked at me, and I looked at him. He said, quietly, "It stood here." I said, "What do you mean, stood?" He said, "I mean, it was here, in this place, not moving, for a period of time, considering." I looked at the impression again, thought about the night before. The 40 minutes of presence to the south, the rhythm that kept refusing to become predictable. I said, "Was this while it was in the south?" He said, "Yes." I said, "It was 12 feet away." He said, "Yes." I sat back on my heels and looked at the circuit. The whole thing, all the way around, complete, unbroken. And then I looked at the center of it, at the ground where we had slept and sat and breathed through the night. And I understood something in a way that bypassed language entirely. We had been inside it, not observed from a distance, not watched from the perimeter. We had been inside the circuit it made, inside the boundary it drew around us, and it had drawn that boundary deliberately. And we had spent the night not knowing we were enclosed. Thomas finished walking the outside of the circuit and came back to where Raymond and I were crouched. He looked at the deeper impression for a moment. Then he looked at the horizon to the north, the direction we had been heading the day before when Raymond turned around. He said, "We should photograph what we can, and then we should go." Nobody disagreed. I took photographs. I don't know what happened to them. That's a separate thing I don't fully understand and am not ready to discuss. But I took them. And we packed in a way that was efficient, without being rushed, because rushing would have been the wrong signal. And we walked back to the truck without looking behind us more than was necessary. And Raymond drove us out the way we came in. The dry wash looked exactly as it had when we crossed it 2 days before. Unremarkable. Sandy floor. Smooth, worn edges. I looked at it as we passed and thought about what Raymond had said the first night, about the difference between moving through a place and maintaining it. Whatever was out there maintained that wash, maintained the whole corridor, had been maintaining it probably for longer than any of us had been alive. And we had walked into the middle of its maintenance, and it had noticed, and it had decided, and for reasons I will never fully understand, it had let us leave. I didn't say any of that out loud. I just watched the wash pass behind us through the window and kept my eyes moving, the way Tanis had taught me, until the corridor was gone and the ordinary desert came back, and I could breathe without thinking about what breathing inside that circuit had meant. What I was told not to repeat. Raymond spoke once on the drive back, not to the group, to me. The other two were in the rear seats, and I was in the front passenger seat, and Raymond kept his eyes on the road, which was a dirt road that demanded attention, and he spoke in a way that was clearly not for Thomas and Calvin to hear, not because they didn't know what he knew, but because what he was about to say was being said specifically to me, for my specific situation, which was different from theirs. He said, "You're going to want to understand what that was." I said, "Yes." He said, "That wanting is the problem." He let that sit for a moment. The truck moved through the desert, and the windows were up, even though it was hot, genuinely hot, the kind of October heat that surprises you. And I didn't ask about the windows, because by that point I had learned to not ask about the things that were done quietly and with intention. He said, "There are things that exist in certain places that have a relationship with being known, not a neutral relationship. The knowing is part of how they operate. When you learn the name of a thing like that, when you seek it, when you research it, when you ask the right people the right questions until someone gives you the word for it, you have done something. You have opened something. The name is not a label. It is a door, and doors work in both directions." I didn't say anything. He said, "The people who know what that is, who have always known, they don't say the name. Not because they've forgotten it, because saying it is a choice they've decided not to make. Every generation makes that choice again. It costs something to keep making it, but the cost of the alternative is not recoverable." I watched the desert move past the window, flat and pale and bright in the October sun. Normal looking, the kind of landscape that asks nothing of you. He said, "You're going to go home and you're going to think about it, and at some point you're going to start looking. I know that because I know how people like you work. You need things to have edges. You need to be able to put them in a category and close the category. What you saw out there doesn't have edges, and it doesn't fit in a category. And the part of you that can't accept that is going to go looking for a way to make it fit." I said, "And if I do?" He said, "Then you'll find something. That's not in question. There are names for it in old sources, in records that exist in places people like you know how to find. And when you find the name and you say it, even just in your own mind, even just reading it silently, you will have used the door. And what's on the other side will know the door was used." He didn't say anything else for a long time after that. I thought about the circuit in the sand, the impression that was deeper than the others, the 40 minutes of presence to the south while we breathed and lay still inside a boundary we hadn't known was there. I thought about Raymond sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, listening with his whole body, and what it had cost him to sit that still for that long, that close to something like that. I said, "Did it let us leave?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that I thought this was another thing he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because Raymond asked it to." It took me a moment to understand that he was speaking about himself in the third person. Not a verbal slip, a deliberate distance. Like what he had done the night before, whatever negotiation or appeal or acknowledgement had passed between him and whatever sat in the south outside our camp for 40 minutes had been done by a version of him that operated in a register he didn't fully claim as his ordinary self. I didn't ask what he had said. I didn't ask what form the asking had taken. Some questions are doors too, and I had learned enough by then to recognize the shape of one. We reached the paved road, and Raymond accelerated, and the character of the ride changed, and something in the atmosphere of the truck shifted, some held quality releasing,
and Thomas said something quietly to Calvin in the back seat that I didn't catch, and Calvin made a short sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else. Raymond said, "One more thing." I looked at him. He said, "If you ever feel like something has reoriented in you, something small, something in the way you hold your attention, come and tell me." I said, "Has that happened to people before?" He looked at the road. He said, "It happened to me. The first time I went in there, a long time ago. I noticed it and I addressed it and it resolved. But I noticed it because someone told me to watch for it. So I'm telling you." I said, "What does it feel like?" He said, "Like your attention has a new direction it wants to go. A pull. Subtle at first. Like curiosity, but with more weight behind it. And the pull will be toward that place. Toward trying to understand it. Toward finding the name." He said, "If you feel that pull, don't follow it. Come find me instead." I said I would. I meant it at the time. I have felt the pull. I want to be honest about that. Not constantly, not overwhelmingly, but it's there. The way Raymond described it. A weighted curiosity that orients toward that corridor, toward the question of what maintains it, what drew that circle around us, what stood 12 feet from where I slept and decided. I haven't looked for the name.
I want to be careful about how I say this next part. I haven't looked for the name, but I'm also not certain that not looking is the same as not finding. Because here's the thing about doors. Sometimes knowing that a door exists, understanding its function, sitting with the shape of what it opens onto, that proximity might itself be a form of use. I don't know. I genuinely don't know where that line is. Raymond might know. Raymond, if he's watching anything, is probably watching whatever direction I'm facing right now. Daniel Ferris sat on the side of a road facing the desert and didn't speak for the better part of a day. I've thought about what he might have found that I didn't. What question he asked that I learned not to. Whether he found a name somewhere, in an old source, in a record that exists in a place people like him know how to find. Whether he used the door without knowing it was a door. I don't know. What I know is this. There is a corridor in the high desert that something maintains. It has been there longer than the language we would use to describe it. The people who have lived closest to it for the longest time made a collective decision, generations ago, not to name it. And they have kept that decision. At a cost I don't fully understand. And that cost is real, and it is ongoing. And it is chosen deliberately, because the alternative is worse. I went in there once. I came back. I was allowed to come back. Don't go looking for what I found. Not the place. Not the name. Not the record in the old source that will feel, when you find it, like an answer. It isn't an answer. It's the door. And I've said enough already. I'm not sure how much of this telling has been safe. I've tried to stay on the right side of the line Raymond described. I've tried to give you the shape of the thing, without giving you the thing itself.
But shape implies form, and form implies name. And I don't know, sitting here now, whether I've been more careful than Daniel was, or just careful in different ways that amount to the same outcome. Raymond told me to come find him if I felt the pull. I'm feeling it right now.